Welcome to my channel, Hotspot with Loveth, the ultimate spot for all things entertainment, ranging from celebrity gists, reviews, interesting stories, and African folktales. Subscribe now.
A sleek, black SUV hummed quietly in the underground garage. Leaning against it, Lyra Gray checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes, her sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit area. She wasn't used to waiting, especially not for a client. The mission brief had come through less than 48 hours ago, and everything about it felt off. The assignment was simple enough: protect Kian Westwood, heir to the Westwood fortune, an empire built on pharmaceuticals, tech, and real estate. The problem: Kian didn't seem to care about the growing threats to his life. "How much longer, Gray?" The voice in her earpiece crackled. It was her handler, Conrad. "He should be down any minute," Lyra replied, her tone measured. "This kid better be worth the trouble." Just then, the elevator doors pinged open, and out stepped Kian Westwood. He looked nothing like she expected. Instead of the cocky, arrogant playboy she'd pictured, Kian was tall, with dark, tousled hair and piercing blue eyes that scanned the garage with sharp intelligence. He walked with an easy grace that seemed to contradict the danger surrounding him. "Lyra Gray?" he asked, his voice cool and composed. "You're the one they've sent to keep me safe." Lyra narrowed her eyes. "If by they, you mean your father's security team, then yes." He smirked. "Great. Let's get one thing straight. I'm only doing this because of my father. I don't need a babysitter." Lyra resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "I'm not your babysitter, Westwood. I'm your bodyguard. There's a difference." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, sliding into the back seat of the SUV. "Let's get this over with." As Lyra slid into the driver's seat, the tension between them was palpable. She couldn't tell if it was his defiance or the dangerous undercurrents of the situation, but something about this assignment made her uneasy. They had barely left the garage when the first sign of trouble appeared. In her rearview mirror, Lyra spotted a motorcycle tailing them too closely. Its rider was dressed in all black, helmet hiding his face, and the bike's movements were too calculated to be a coincidence. Lyra's instincts kicked in. "Hold on." She swerved the SUV down a narrow alley, her hands steady on the wheel as Kian grabbed the handle above his door. "What the hell are you doing?" "Shut up and trust me," Lyra snapped, weaving through the back streets with precision. The motorcycle followed, speeding up in pursuit. Her heart raced, but her mind stayed sharp. She glanced at Kian, who was gripping the seat now, eyes wide. Despite his earlier bravado, it was clear he wasn't used to this level of danger. "Who is that?" Kian demanded. "Someone who doesn't want you alive," she replied tersely. Lyra took another sharp turn, but the bike was relentless, closing the distance. With a glance at the side mirror, she reached under her seat, grabbing a small but powerful handgun, and rolled down her window. Kian's eyes widened. "Are you seriously going to shoot while driving?" Lyra didn't respond. She aimed carefully, firing 2 shots. The first missed, but the second hit its mark. The bike wobbled, and the rider lost control, crashing into a pile of crates as they zoomed around another corner. Lyra accelerated, not waiting to see if he would recover. Kian was silent for a moment, catching his breath. "That was impressive," he finally said, his voice tinged with something that sounded like awe. Lyra didn't respond, her focus on the road ahead. But she couldn't deny the thrill that had coursed through her veins during the chase. This wasn't just a job, it was personal now. That night, they were holed up in a safe house, a luxury penthouse on the outskirts of the city, far from the Westwood mansion. Kian paced the length of the room while Lyra stood near the window, watching the street below. "Why would someone want me dead?" Kian asked, his earlier cockiness replaced by genuine concern. Lyra glanced at him. "You've got enemies. Your family's wealth alone is enough to paint a target on your back." He shook his head. "I don't buy it. There's something else going on." Lyra's instincts told her he was right. The ambush earlier had been too organized, too professional. This wasn't a simple robbery or random attack. Someone was hunting him. "Why don't you tell me what you're not saying?" Lyra asked, her tone cold and businesslike. Kian stopped pacing, meeting her gaze. "You think I'm hiding something. I think you're not telling me the whole story," she replied. "And if I'm going to keep you alive, I need to know everything." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. A week ago, I found something. Odd. A series of bank transfers linked to one of my father's subsidiaries. Large amounts of money being funneled to offshore accounts. And," Lyra pressed, "I dug a little deeper and found out that the accounts belong to someone close to the family. Someone with the power to make me disappear if I get too close to the truth." "Who?" Kian hesitated, glancing away. "My uncle." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Your father's brother." "Yeah. He's always been involved in the family business, but he's been acting strange lately. My father doesn't want to believe it, but I think he's hiding something dangerous." Lyra considered this. If Kian's uncle was behind the attacks, it meant they were dealing with more than just petty criminals. This was a conspiracy within the Westwood family, and if Kian was right, he was in more danger than he realized. "You're going to have to trust me," Lyra said after a long pause. "If your uncle really is behind this, we'll need more than just suspicion. We need proof." Kian nodded, but Lyra could see the fear in his eyes. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse. It was a deadly race against time, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. As the days passed, the bond between Lyra and Kian grew. Despite their rocky start, Kian began to rely on her instincts, while Lyra found herself drawn to his quiet strength and determination. There was something beneath his polished exterior, a vulnerability he rarely showed to the world. One evening, after a particularly tense day of investigating, they found themselves on the rooftop of the penthouse, the city lights flickering below them. Lyra sat on the ledge, her gaze distant as Kian approached, handing her a glass of wine. "You never take a break, do you?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Not when I'm on a job," she replied, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "You should try it sometime," Kian said, his voice soft. "There's more to life than just surviving." Lyra looked at him, her walls momentarily lowering. "Maybe," she admitted. For a moment, the tension between them shifted, no longer just professional, but something deeper. Kian reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and the connection between them flared like a live wire. Before either of them could speak, the moment was shattered by the sound of gunfire, ripping through the quiet night. Lyra reacted instantly, pushing Kian to the ground and pulling her gun. Her heart pounded as she scanned the rooftop, searching for the shooter. But whoever it was had already vanished into the shadows. "Looks like we're not safe anywhere," Kian muttered, his voice shaken. Lyra's eyes were cold as she stood, helping him to his feet. "They're getting closer. We need to move." As they fled the rooftop, the unspoken truth hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust, about loyalty, and about the undeniable pull they felt toward each other. But in a world full of danger, could they afford to give in to their growing connection? The tension in the air was suffocating as Lyra and Kian rushed back into the safe house. Her mind raced with possibilities: who was behind the attack, how they had been tracked so easily, and what it would take to get ahead of their enemies. "Pack your things," Lyra ordered, her voice sharp. "We're leaving." Kian hesitated, still rattled by the gunfire. "And go where? They found us here. What makes you think we'll be safe anywhere else?" Lyra paused, staring at him. The uncertainty in his voice was new, but she couldn't afford to let it affect her. She had to stay focused. "I have another safe house. Off the grid. We can regroup there." Kian didn't argue further. He grabbed his things while Lyra kept watch, her eyes scanning the windows, her instincts heightened. She had been on assignments like this before, jobs where the stakes were life and death, but this one felt different. More personal. And the way Kian looked at her. She pushed the thought away. Now was not the time for distractions. Minutes later, they were back in the SUV, speeding down an empty stretch of highway under the cover of night. The city lights were fading behind them as they drove into the countryside, the silence between them heavy but charged. "Why do you do this?" Kian finally broke the quiet, his voice low. "Protect people, I mean." Lyra kept her eyes on the road, but his question lingered. She didn't usually talk about herself. She was the protector, the one who stood in the shadows. But something about Kian made her want to open up, if only for a moment. "Because I'm good at it," she said simply. "And because sometimes, it feels like the only thing I can control." Kian studied her in the dim light of the dashboard. "So it's not about the money." She smirked. "The money doesn't hurt. But no, it's more than that." There was a long pause, and when Kian spoke again, his voice was quieter, more vulnerable. "What do you do when you're not protecting people?" Lyra's grip tightened on the wheel. "I don't think about that. I'm always protecting someone. That's how I survive." Kian's gaze softened. "Maybe you should think about it. There's more to life than just surviving, you know." Lyra didn't answer. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not now. But deep down, Kian's words unsettled her. What would life be like if she let herself want something more? The safe house was a small, isolated cabin nestled in the woods. It was far enough from the city that it would take their enemies time to track them, if they could at all. As they pulled up to the cabin, Lyra felt the tension in her body ease slightly. Here, at least for the moment, they could breathe. They entered the cabin, and Lyra immediately set to work securing the perimeter while Kian explored the sparse but comfortable interior. "This place is cozy," he remarked, sitting on the worn leather couch. Lyra gave a brief smile. "It's not about comfort. It's about safety." Kian watched her as she moved, checking locks and setting up surveillance. "You know, you never did answer my question." "Which one?" she asked, distracted. "What do you want? After all of this is over." Lyra paused, turning to face him. His blue eyes were intense, searching hers for something more than just a professional response. She felt a tug in her chest, something she wasn't used to. For so long, her life had been about the mission. But Kian was making her question that, making her think about a future she'd never considered. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed, breaking the moment. She glanced at the screen. It was Conrad. "Gray," she answered. "We've got a problem." Conrad's voice crackled through the line. "Your safe house isn't as secure as you think." Lyra's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's been feeding your location to the enemy. I don't know how deep this goes, but you've got a mole in your team." Lyra's jaw clenched. A mole. Someone close to her was betraying them. "Who?" she demanded. "I'm still working on that." But whoever it is, they're high up. They've been tracking you from the start. Lyra's mind raced. If there was a mole, it meant they were in even more danger than she thought. They couldn't trust anyone. She ended the call and turned to Kian, her face grim. "We need to leave. Now." Kian stood, his face reflecting her worry. "What happened?" "There's a leak in the security team," she said, her voice tight. "Someone's been giving away our location." Kian's eyes widened. "But, how?" Lyra grabbed her bag, her movements quick and precise. "Doesn't matter. We just have to move." But as they headed for the door, they heard the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. Lyra cursed under her breath. Too late. She pulled Kian back, pushing him toward the back door. "Stay low. Don't make a sound." Outside, figures moved in the darkness, armed and dangerous. Lyra's heart pounded as she positioned herself near the window, watching. Whoever they were, they had come prepared. "Kian," she whispered, her voice low. "Stay behind me." The seconds stretched into an eternity as the figures closed in. Lyra tightened her grip on her gun, her body tense and ready for a fight. But as the first man stepped into the light, something about him seemed familiar. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. It was one of her own, someone from her team. A man she'd worked with for years, someone she had trusted. And he was leading the ambush. Betrayal burned in her chest like fire. This wasn't just an attack. It was personal. The first shot rang out, shattering the stillness of the night. Lyra shoved Kian to the floor just as a bullet slammed into the wall behind them. "Stay down," she shouted, returning fire. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how her own team had turned against her. Conrad's warning echoed in her head, but it didn't matter now. All that mattered was getting Kian out alive. "Go!" she yelled, pushing Kian toward the back door. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes locking with hers in silent understanding. She saw the fear in his gaze, but also the trust. Without another word, he sprinted toward the exit. Lyra followed, firing at their attackers as they moved through the house. The air was thick with tension, the sound of gunfire deafening. As they burst out the back door, Lyra grabbed Kian's arm, pulling him toward the trees. "We need to get to the car." But just as they reached the edge of the woods, a voice called out from behind them. "Going somewhere." Lyra froze. The voice was chillingly familiar. She turned slowly, her heart pounding as she faced her betrayer. It was Conrad. He stood there, gun in hand, a twisted smile on his face. "Didn't think you'd figure it out so soon, Gray." Lyra's blood ran cold. Conrad, the man she had trusted for years, the man who had been her handler on countless missions, was the mole. Kian stepped forward, his fists clenched. Why are you doing this?" Conrad chuckled. "Money, westward. Your family's fortune is worth a lot more than loyalty." Lyra's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on her gun. She had trusted Conrad with her life, and now he was the one standing between her and survival. "I won't let you take him," she said, her voice deadly calm. Conrad's smile faded. "You don't have a choice." But as he raised his gun, Lyra moved faster than he anticipated. In a blur of motion, she fired, the shot hitting Conrad in the shoulder. He staggered back, his gun falling from his hand as he cried out in pain. "Run!" Lyra shouted to Kian, pulling him toward the car as Conrad slumped to the ground. But as they fled into the night, the danger was far from over. They had escaped for now, but the game was just beginning. Chapter 8: A Desperate Escape. Lyra and Kian raced through the dense woods, the darkness around them thick and oppressive. The only sounds were their ragged breaths and the distant shouts of Conrad's men searching for them. Lyra's mind raced, planning their next move while pushing down the sting of betrayal that came from Conrad's treachery. "Keep moving," she urged Kian as they darted through the underbrush. "We can't stop." "Not yet." Kian's face was pale, his breaths labored, but he nodded and kept pace with her. She could see the fear in his eyes, but also determination. He wasn't the pampered heir she had thought at the start. Kian had changed. They reached a clearing where the SUV had been hidden. Lyra quickly unlocked the doors, ushering Kian inside before jumping behind the wheel. Her hands shook as she started the engine, but she forced herself to stay calm. As they sped down the dirt road leading away from the cabin, Kian finally spoke, his voice tight with anger and confusion. "I trusted him, Lyra. How could Conrad betray you like that? Why?" Lyra clenched her jaw, her eyes fixed on the road. "Money, power, greed. It's always about that." She took a sharp turn, the tires skidding on the gravel. "But right now, we don't have time to figure out why. We need to focus on staying alive." "But where do we go now?" Kian asked, rubbing his hands together, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "It seems like every place we hide, they find us." Lyra's mind raced through the few options they had left. She knew they couldn't run forever, and with Conrad having turned, the number of people they could trust had shrunk to nearly zero. "There's one last place," she said finally, her voice steady but laced with hesitation. "A safe house only I know about. It's off the grid. But getting there won't be easy." Kian nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll follow your lead, Lyra." The drive to the safe house was long and tense, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions. Lyra's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but she kept her focus on the mission, keeping Kian alive. As dawn began to break, they arrived at the safe house, an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. Lyra had used it years ago during another mission and had kept it in reserve for emergencies like this. "It doesn't look like much," Kian remarked as they pulled up to the dilapidated building. "That's the point," Lyra replied as they stepped out of the SUV. "No one will think to look for us here." Inside, the warehouse was dark and cold, but Lyra had stashed some basic supplies. They set up camp in the back room, barricading the doors and windows. Kian sat down heavily on an old crate, rubbing his temples. "What now? We can't keep running forever." Lyra paced the room, her mind working furiously. "We need to turn the tables. If Conrad is behind this, he's doing it for money and power. The only way to stop him is to take away his leverage." Kian looked up at her, realization dawning in his eyes. "The offshore accounts. The ones I found linked to my uncle. That's how they're funding all of this." Lyra nodded. "If we can trace the money back to Conrad and expose him, he'll lose everything. But we need proof." Kian stood, determination hardening his features. "I know where the records are. My uncle kept them hidden in a secure vault at one of the family's old estates. If we can get in, we can get the evidence we need." Lyra considered the plan. It was risky, breaking into the Westwood estate would be dangerous. But it was their best shot at ending this. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "We're going after the records." Night fell as Lyra and Kian approached the sprawling Westwood estate. The massive mansion was heavily guarded, but Lyra's training kicked in as she guided them through the shadows, avoiding security patrols and surveillance cameras. The estate was a maze of marble hallways and opulent rooms, but Kian led them with precision. He knew the layout well, having grown up there, and within minutes, they were standing outside the entrance to the hidden vault. "It's behind this panel," Kian whispered, pressing a hidden switch. The wall slid open, revealing a high-tech security door. Lyra quickly disabled the security system, and they entered the vault. Inside, rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals stood in neat lines. Kian went straight to the back, pulling out a file filled with documents. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with both relief and fear. "Everything we need to take Conrad down." But before they could leave, a voice echoed from the doorway. "Going somewhere." Lyra and Kian spun around to see Conrad standing there, a gun in his hand, flanked by two armed men. His face was twisted with a smug smile. "You really thought you could outsmart me, Gray?" Conrad sneered, stepping closer. "You should have stayed out of this." Lyra's mind raced, her fingers twitching toward her gun, but she knew Conrad had the upper hand. He had them cornered. "I always knew you were ambitious," Lyra said coldly. "But betraying your own team. That's a new low, even for you." Conrad chuckled. "Ambition is what keeps you alive in this world, Lyra. You know that better than anyone. But you've always been too loyal for your own good." Kian stepped forward, his voice filled with anger. "You're not going to get away with this, Conrad. We have the proof. It's over." Conrad raised his gun, aiming it directly at Kian. "Oh, it's far from over, Westward. Once you're out of the picture, I'll make sure that proof never sees the light of day." The tension in the room was suffocating. Lyra knew she had only seconds to act. She glanced at Kian, who gave her a small nod. He trusted her completely. Without hesitation, Lyra sprang into action. She grabbed a nearby chair and threw it at one of Conrad's men, knocking him off balance. In the same motion, she drew her gun and fired at the other guard, taking him down in a single shot. Conrad cursed, firing at Lyra, but she was already moving, dodging behind a pillar. Kian lunged for the documents, but Conrad's gun was trained on him again. "Stop!" Conrad barked, his eyes wild with anger. Lyra emerged from the shadows, her gun raised. "It's over, Conrad. Drop the gun." For a moment, Conrad hesitated, his eyes flicking between Lyra and Kian. Then, with a snarl, he lunged at Kian, gun raised. Lyra fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the vault as Conrad collapsed to the ground, his gun clattering beside him. The silence that followed was deafening. Kian stood frozen for a moment, staring at Conrad's lifeless body. Then he turned to Lyra, his eyes wide with shock. "It's over," she said softly, holstering her gun. "You're safe now." Kian nodded, but the weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy in the air. He stepped closer to Lyra, his voice trembling slightly. "Thank you, for everything." Lyra met his gaze, her heart pounding. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something more than just the mission. There was something between them, something real. But there was still work to do. "Come on," she said, her voice steady. "Let's get these files to the authorities." Weeks had passed since Conrad's downfall. The truth about the conspiracy had come to light, and Kian's uncle had been arrested, his illegal dealings exposed for the world to see. The Westwood family was safe, and Kian had taken control of the family empire, determined to right the wrongs that had nearly cost him his life. As for Lyra, she had returned to her life of protecting others, but something had changed. Kian had changed her. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Lyra stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching the skyline. A familiar voice broke the silence. "You're hard to find, you know." Lyra turned to see Kian standing there, a smile on his face. He had that same look in his eyes, the one that had haunted her since their time together. "I'm good at hiding," she said with a smirk. Kian stepped closer, his voice soft. You don't have to hide from me, Lyra." For the first time, she let herself smile. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than just surviving. And with Kian by her side, she was ready to find out.